Okay, so it is 11 o'clock. I see people are joining. I think we'll go ahead and get started here, and then people obviously can continue to join as we go. Thank you so much for joining us this morning and on a Monday after, some holiday time. I know that at least I've been having a little bit of a struggle today, so I appreciate folks jumping on and joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Alex Proctor. Alex is a consultant with QFrame and CyberForce Q, specializing in information security program implementation, quantifiable measurement, and strategic advancement. So I'm going to, without further ado, flip it over to Alex. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Karen. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you with us today, especially on a day when we know you could be out doing some Cyber Monday shopping or anything else for that matter. So we're privileged to have you with us. My name is Alex, and today we're going to be walking through the NIST Privacy Framework. I'd like to start off just by establishing the agenda for this webinar today. The first thing I'll do is introduce CyberForce Q and myself, and then we'll dive into an overview of what the NIST Privacy Framework actually is. Next, we'll check out how the NIST Privacy Framework can be used to complement work that's already being done to measure and align to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. I know this is such an important consideration because the Cybersecurity Framework has been around for much longer, it's been more broadly adapted, and many who are considering utilizing the Privacy Framework have probably implemented the CSF at some point in the past. If you don't have any sort of background with the CSF, no worries, you'll still be able to get a great feel for what this Privacy Framework is all about. We'll wrap up the session by identifying some of the points that, if you're trying to determine if the framework is right for you, some things that might help you with that decision making. And then at the end of the session, there will be time for questions and discussion. So feel free to jot down any questions you might have as we work through this together. And in fact, feel free to send them over through the app as I'm sharing here so that we can queue them up and get to them immediately at the end. All right, so to kick off the introduction, I want to take just a moment to introduce CyberForce Q, the company that I'm with. We are a collective force for good in the cyber realm. If you've ever worked with us before, you'll know just how important that collective part is to us. Just about everything that our company does is geared towards advancing cybersecurity programs and doing so in a quantifiable way that we can measure. Like I already told you, my name is Alex. 2021 will be my 10th year here at CyberForce Q, so I've been here for a little while. I worked in our operations center for the first half of my career here, and I've since become the leader of our QFrame and strategy teams. QFrame, as we call it, is all about measuring cybersecurity and then using that measurement to produce really well-informed security strategies. If you're curious, the tie-in between QFrame and the NIST Privacy Framework, the subject of this presentation, is the fact that we can rely on QFrame to measure and advance privacy objectives from the framework, just like we do for security objectives from various cybersecurity control sets. All right, so with that said, let's take a closer look at the NIST Privacy Framework. Because we are talking about a privacy framework today, I thought it would be a good idea to discuss the differences between cybersecurity and privacy risk. The two concepts are very closely related, but they are in fact different. I'll start with privacy risk. Here, just about everything revolves around sensitive personal data. Some of the considerations here will be the type of data your organization stores about people, how it's used and how it's accessed, and what your retention requirements are for that sensitive personal data. While cybersecurity controls are often used to implement privacy requirements and to reduce privacy risk, security controls tend to operate at a higher level. I'll give you a hypothetical example to help drive this home. Let's consider a hospital, which has security controls in place to restrict access to sensitive EPHI. Now, envision a scenario where this hospital is caring for some sort of interesting celebrity guest, and that this guest has the potential to generate a lot of curiosity amongst the workforce. You can probably understand the situation I'm creating here. The hospital has reasonable security controls in place, But on top of that, they have a privacy obligation to ensure that the EPHI for this guest and any guest is only utilized on a need-to-know basis. An uninvolved team member might have a legitimate security permission to access this celebrity's EPHI, but if they were to do so, it would be a violation of privacy. The graphic that you're seeing at the bottom of the screen does a really nice job of summarizing the relationship between cybersecurity and privacy risks. This visual and others that I'll be sharing today can be found right within the NIST Privacy Framework PDF guide, and we'll make sure to share a link out to everyone who's attending. All right, so now that we've covered that topic, let's take a look at the privacy framework itself. If you're not familiar with NIST, we're talking about the National Institute of Standards and Technology. NIST is a part of our government operated within the Department of Commerce. NIST is responsible for developing really thousands of reference materials for all sorts of industries, not just security. In cybersecurity, though, we've been relying on a wide variety of NIST standards for a very long time. Anyhow, NIST created this privacy framework, and it's new. Version 1.0 was released in January of this year. We know that it has been a weird year, so if you're just hearing about this now, you're probably not alone. This framework is very intentional about being voluntary. It has not been created to serve as some sort of requirement, but rather to make it easier for organizations to manage privacy risk while accomplishing their business objectives. Now, because there are privacy requirements out there which are not voluntary, the standard is built with compatibility in mind. You'll also find that this NIST privacy framework is broadly applicable. It's not intended for any one specific industry or any specific size of company. It's truly meant for any organization that wants to measure and improve the privacy of individuals with regard to its company. If all this sounds familiar, it's because NIST took the exact same approach with their wildly popular cybersecurity framework, which was released over 6 years ago now. Both documents were developed as public-private collaborations, and they're both extremely flexible. In other words, neither of these frameworks will tell you exactly how to achieve a certain outcome, but they'll emphasize the fact that every organization is unique and capable of implementing the specific measures that are best suited for them. Before we move on, there is one more thing that I'd like to mention. In addition to releasing this privacy framework, NIST has also recently overhauled their 853 series to version 5. If you're not familiar with this one, it's essentially a very detailed set of controls, and in many ways, it's the exact opposite of these high-level CSF and privacy frameworks. Anyhow, in this new version, privacy has taken a central role, which was never the case in the past. It even made the title. Although 853 is not our topic for today, I thought this was worth mentioning briefly, just to convey the fact that privacy is taking on an increasing role in traditional security-oriented guidance. NIST has been a leader in this push, but they're not alone. And I would personally expect to see privacy controls continue to pick up steam across the board. Okay, so back to the NIST privacy framework. We'll take a look at the structure of this thing, as well as a few examples of the privacy recommendations contained within. One of the things that I can really appreciate about how NIST built this document is the fact that they mirrored the structure from the cybersecurity framework, because it makes it so much more convenient to use the two in tandem. There are really 3 main parts to the privacy framework, and I'll explain each. First, we have something called the framework core. This is the section of the framework that contains the actual controls surrounding the management of privacy functions. Now, I have to say, because these are high level, NIST themselves actually doesn't call these controls, and they instead refer to them as either activities or outcomes. NIST would refer to the contents of those 853 series documents as controls. Just like in the CSF, there are a couple of different logical layers here. Broadly speaking, all of these privacy activities and outcomes are broken up into 5 different functions. We have identify, govern, control, communicate, and protect. They all have a P attached at the end of the name to differentiate from the very similar names within the cybersecurity framework. I'll give you a very quick explanation of what each of these categories is intended to tackle. The identify category is simply about understanding privacy risks. This applies to the understanding of individuals' privacy interests, as well as understanding how sensitive personal data is used in your organization. The controls in this section essentially set the stage for the rest of the framework. Next up, we have the govern category. This one involves understanding legal privacy requirements, risk tolerance, and your organization's privacy values. And this is where privacy policy ties in heavily. Third up, we have control. And this section is about putting controls and activities in place to make sure that your organization has the data management granularity available to actually implement its privacy values and requirements. Next up, we have communicate, excuse me, which is about making sure that there's two-way dialogue between your organization and then everyone whose privacy you're tasked to protect. That might be your employees or it might be your customers. Finally, the last category is protect. And this one's about safeguards, specifically for preventing cybersecurity-related privacy events. Within each of these functional areas, we then have a number of categories. And for the best way to convey what those are, I'm going to flip over to my next screen here. And as you can see, there are 18 different categories. In the interest of time, I won't walk through each, but I'd like you to notice just how broad this framework is. You'll see high-level categories surrounding the business environment, all the way to some very focused topics like identity management. If you can make it out from the screenshot, you'll be able to see that there's actually these category IDs at the end of each name, and these make it easy to tell which functions the category is from. So now that you can see the categories, understand that each of them has at least a couple of specific activities and outcomes within. So for example, let's look at the very first section, inventory and mapping. The easiest way to convey this was to pull a screenshot right from the Privacy Framework document, so that's what you're looking at here. In the first column, you can see the overall function description, and then we have the inventory and mapping category description, and then finally in that last and third column, you'll see the actual actions and outcomes or the controls contained in this category. I'll let you gaze down this list, and you'll see several specific things that help support the implementation of strong inventory and mapping capability. If we were to work through the entire control set, you'd see similar categories, similar subcategories within each of these 18 categories. Now, I want to take a moment to convey some of the similarities in control structure between the CSF and the NIST Privacy Framework. This screenshot is actually from the CSF, and it shows all of the security controls in the risk management category, along with a whole lot of cross-references for each. You'll see that most of these controls are oriented around the process of completing a security risk assessment. In RA3, we're identifying threat actors and their characteristics. RA1 is about understanding your vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions. And then RA4 is about understanding the impact of potential risks. It all ties together in the 5th and 6th controls, where the control set calls for the actual tabulation of risks, as well as making sure that a decision is made for how to handle each. As I flip over to the NIST Privacy Framework, you'll see the same logical category, risk assessment, but now it's within the context of privacy. The controls are similar, but in this case, they're about understanding the context of privacy data, making sure that privacy risks are identified, and then in a very similar way, tabulating and then prioritizing those risks. We'll talk about it more in just a moment, but you're probably starting to get the feel that these frameworks can operate well together. Also, when you look at the screenshot, you may notice that it does not contain informative references like we saw in the screenshot from the security framework. NIST actually chose to tackle this in a different way this time around. And for the privacy framework, they're all found in a special resource section of NIST's website. I find this to be more practical just because the cybersecurity control ecosystem changes so much faster than NIST publishes new versions of these frameworks. For example, on the security side, we've seen one major update over the last 6 years. So you can imagine how the cross references might lose relevance pretty quickly. As a quick detour, I wanted to show an example of something out of this new reference library. One of the cool things about what NIST is doing is that they're enabling third parties to share their reference content. In this case, you're looking at a mapping of the privacy framework to ISO 27701, which is ISO's privacy information management system. This cross-mapping was actually developed and shared by Microsoft, who presumably had some reason to perform this cross-mapping and was kind enough to share with the community. Before we continue here, I did want to give one more example of some NIST privacy content that's a bit more specialized than what we might find in the CSF. On your screen, you can see the two controls I chose for this example, and they both involve data processing, one for processing management and the other for disassociated processing. If that term disassociated processing is new to you, it's basically about minimizing the information that can be inferred or otherwise known about individuals whose privacy you're responsible for. As I believe I've already mentioned, the framework isn't so granular that it's going to suggest specific ways to reach these outcomes. While doing so would make it more straightforward to follow, it would be damaging to the flexibility. So with this framework, it's more about the outcomes than the specific ways that they're achieved. And that's what makes this so flexible to use. All right, so I hope I've conveyed what that framework core is all about, and I'm going to take a step back now because there are two more parts of the framework worth mentioning. I'm not going to go into as much detail here, but I want to make sure to explain what they are. After the core, the next part of the framework is something called profiles. And basically, this part of the document provides a structure that can be used to compare your current state of privacy risks against your desired state of privacy. And this really just allows you to convey very clearly where things stand, what the target is, and then what are the specific privacy advancements that are necessary for you to reach that target state. And then finally, NIST has something called implementation tiers. This is the third major part of the document. There are 4 of them, and they're used to help understand and convey the maturity of each of the individual categories in the framework. Tier 1 is called partial, Tier 2 is risk informed, Tier 3 is repeatable, and then Tier 4 is adaptive. As you can imagine, these tiers describe a few levels worth of maturity advancement, and specifically they focus on the privacy risk management process, integrated privacy risk management, data processing ecosystem relationships, and then the overall standing of the workforce. All right, so at this point, I've conveyed what the NIST Privacy Framework is about, and now let's look at those inevitable questions about interoperability. What can this look like when actually used alongside the CSF? I've already described how the two frameworks are similar, but now let's get more specific about two different approaches that can be used to integrate them. Both options that I'm about to share have been officially recognized and even suggested by NIST themselves, and there are pros and cons with both. The first integration option is simply to rely on the entirety of both frameworks at the same time. This approach would seemingly work well in organizations that have separate cybersecurity and privacy teams and would allow for very strong direct management of privacy risks. The disadvantage here is that there's a fair amount of redundancy, not just between the two NIST frameworks, but between the concepts of security and privacy entirely. This approach is going to be less efficient than the other alternative that I'll share, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not a great option. Then we have that second option, and here, your organization would rely on the entirety of the cybersecurity framework, along with the less redundant controls from the privacy framework. And specifically, these would be the privacy identify, govern, control, and then communicate functions. The part that was left out, the privacy protect controls, would simply be addressed universally for both security and privacy within the context of the cybersecurity framework's controls. With all that said, I don't really think that there's a right or wrong approach here, and the main takeaway is that you have options if you want to incorporate even some parts of the privacy framework into your CSF-oriented security program. This seems like a good point to mention that if you do end up choosing to utilize both frameworks, NIST has published spreadsheets which are very clear about the bidirectional cross-mappings between the two. These documents can be found in the same reference library that I mentioned a moment ago. These screenshots that you see are just small snippets of both, the top being from the Privacy Framework to CSF conversion, and then the inverse of that on the bottom screenshot. Now that you know what the NIST Privacy Framework is and how it can be used alongside the CSF, you may be looking to determine if this is something that you or your organization would benefit from using. After all, it takes time and energy to use these frameworks, so it's important to make sure that they're providing real value. I can't answer this key question for you, but I can give you some points to consider. The first is straightforward, and it's simply a question of how well you're currently managing your privacy objectives. You can probably start by asking the question, does your organization truly understand the sensitive personal information that it's managing? And while it's certainly possible to do a good job here without this framework, if you do see a weakness, it might be an excellent next step. Even so, I want to be clear that the framework has something to offer, even to those who are already quite mature in terms of privacy, and it can help take you to the next level if that's what you're looking for. For example, I'm currently working with a city that already does a whole lot of great things in the privacy realm. They want to explore the potential to use this framework to help manage the privacy of their constituents as they implement the advanced automated technology that comes along with the modern connected city. The next point surrounds customer privacy and the need to maintain customer trust. Obviously, this is going to be important for everyone, but there are some industries where this is just absolutely mission critical. In these sorts of environments, the structure of this privacy framework could be very useful. It can help establish stronger practices for communicating about privacy and just being straightforward about how your organization is relying upon sensitive personal data that it's entrusted with. The other points which you might want to consider are based on what else you're already measuring. In my opinion, I'd be most inclined to use this framework if I had already implemented the NIST CSF, and especially if I was attempting to manage multiple different privacy-related compliance drivers all at the same time. Just like on the security side, where we often want to measure very specific things as part of a more centralized program, there's an opportunity to do the exact same thing here. All right, so we're nearing the end of my summary on the NIST Privacy Framework. We looked at what it is, how it relates to the CSF, and then some of the things that you might want to consider if you're evaluating it. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that our QFrame web application does support measurement of the NIST Privacy Framework. You can see the controls on the screen there. And if you're not currently a QFrame participant and you're looking for ways to bring your cybersecurity and privacy measurement and strategy to the next level, QFrame might be for you. If you're currently a QFrame participant, just know that these controls are supported and available for you to use. So if you watched this webinar and you have interest in checking them out or implementing them and improving your privacy measurement, perhaps alongside your CSF program, just let us know. All right, so I've reached the end of my prepared material. I put a link here. I know it's not clickable, but if you jot it down or simply search for Privacy Framework, you'll find the NIST website, which you can use to look at the framework itself or all of that reference material that I was talking about. So at this point, we'll see if we've received any questions or further points for discussion. And if you do have a question and you haven't submitted it, feel free to go ahead and do so now. And then Karen, you'll have to let me know if there's any questions in the queue right now.
None so far. Thank you, Alex. And actually, I think people have the ability to unmute and ask, but we're happy to facilitate either way.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Alex, I know you and I had talked about it previously, but looking at coming from where I'm at in business development, we tend to try to put this toward a specific industry or something like that, is that something, does it lend itself to one industry more than the other, or is it, a little bit more across the board?
It definitely, it's actually the complete opposite. If you look at this, the way that it's written and some of the commentary around it from NIST, they are as intentional as possible as not boxing it into any one industry. And a lot of NIST's work came out of creating guidance for federal systems, and I believe, if I remember correctly, that's even how the CSF originally started. It quickly expanded beyond that, and at this point, it's very much a focus of making sure that it's applicable to everyone.
Okay. I mean, which is always kind of interesting, because I know a lot of times when we're looking at strategy and certainly, qualifications or specific certifications that have to happen, a lot of times they tend to be a little bit more industry specific. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about this in a wider reach, and being able to be applied to many different companies and organizations. That's not dependent on, well, if you have this, you got to go this way. If you have this, you got to go this way. So
yeah, and that flexibility does come with a bit of a trade-off, because when you look at these outcomes, it's not like you're getting a checklist of here's exactly what you need to do. You still need to put in the time to figure out what is the most appropriate steps in each of these categories to reach the outcome, and it's going to be different for every organization. But that's where the flexibility comes from.
Gotcha.
And that's why within any of these different areas, it allows us to compare between organizations.
Okay.
I would say more than we would be able to do with something that was more specific, if that
Gotcha.
makes sense.
Yeah. Question from John. Alex, in your experience, which framework is best for a company that has never used this model? So starting from scratch.
Yeah, it's a great question. Personally, I would say that the security framework, the CSF, is the place to start. And the reason for that is the CSF can be used to manage privacy. It's not going to be as robust, and it's going to miss out on some things that aren't included. When I had up that graphic of the Venn diagram, there are some things that are in the privacy framework that are not in the CSF, but privacy is a part of security. And so it is possible to use the CSF to consider privacy. And then perhaps after implementing that, sort of getting the security side underway and actively measured and have an action plan, the next stage of advancement, the privacy framework, would be a great step. I probably wouldn't go in the other direction unless there was a really specialized, business use case. It just wouldn't make as much sense to me to start with the privacy framework and then work in the CSF later. But that's just me.
Okay. Thank you, John, for that question. Do we have any other questions? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. You can reach us at solutions@cyberforceq.com. You can reach out to Alex directly. We're always happy to answer questions, and certainly, especially regarding sort of the strategic implementation as well. Happy to help with that. And as Alex has talked about, it's really an interesting thing that sort of applies across the boards, and will only help strengthen your program, your cybersecurity program, and the stuff that you have going on there. We're sort of getting into the end of the year here, so our next event will be a coffee and collaboration with Dan Lorman on December 9th at 8 a.m. So we'll look forward to hopefully seeing some of the faces here at that presentation, and he'll be talking about security awareness, preparedness, and all the things that you can do to help that culture with the cyber culture within your organization. So we'll make this available. This presentation will be available on our YouTube channel as well in the next week. And for anybody who couldn't attend or had people that wanted to attend, you can certainly share that out. Alex, we appreciate you being here with us this morning and presenting. And as always, great job. And like I said, everybody, we appreciate you coming on a Monday after a holiday weekend and joining us. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You can always also hit us up on our website at cyberforceq.com. So appreciate it, everybody. Have a great rest of your morning.
Thank you all.